everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. Welcome to our CAQH Core participant webinar on the Phase 5 operating rules. I would like to mention a few logistical items. A copy of the slides and the webinar recording will be emailed to you in the next day or so. Also, we will have time at the end of today's program to respond to your questions. I encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. We have a lot to cover during this call. We'll start off with an overview of the approach CAQH Core has taken to help address the prior authorization challenge. We'll then talk about the operating rules package and do a deep dive on the rules. After that, we will move on to the Phase 5 certification test suite and finish off with next steps on the vote. Our goal for this call is to give you enough information and resources that you feel comfortable moving forward with the vote on the Phase 5 operating rules. I would like to thank our guest speakers, in particular, Noam Nahari from Montefiore Medical Center and Rhonda Starkey from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Thank you so much for being here today. And now let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, CAQH Core Director, Robert Bowman. Bob?
Great, thanks, Jessica. Thank you, everyone, for attending today as well. And just as Jessica mentioned, we do want to make sure we address all of your questions or any questions you may have, so feel free to start keying those in now or anytime during the presentations. We make sure we can collate those and have them ready to go during our Q&A. We'd like to go ahead and start with just a quick overview of some of the challenges that are faced by the industry in regards to prior authorization and the multitude of workflows and problems and issues associated with them. Really what we have done and what the industry has done over the last couple of years is really taking a keen focus on this particular aspect of the revenue cycle. And what that means is that part of what we have done is to actually conduct a pretty intense, robust, and comprehensive environmental scan to help find out really where the problems are, the challenges, where can we as an organization, as a group of participants within the industry, do to tackle some of these challenges. I know some of this may be redundant to you. You're all facing many of these challenges yourselves. You're putting in processes and improvements and applications and systems to resolve some of these. But as you can imagine, it is still a significant issue for, in particular for providers and for health plans. As you know, PA is often a siloed transaction. It is separate from eligibility. It is separate from claims. And this in and of itself has a significant impact for providers, particularly in the revenue cycle. Also, it's a significant high volume transaction with over 180 million transactions being conducted per year. Also, it's a very manual transaction. Over half of all PAs start out as a manual transaction, telephone or fax. So again, a really significant burden on health plans and providers in particular. Also, there have been a number of studies from our associates and from our associations that sponsor and work with providers in particular that have focused and have found that it does impact negatively patient care and can be in a substantive and significant way. So how can we as an industry come together and resolve some of these issues? Not only can we help provide better care to our patients, we can also reduce the cost for the transaction. Or the interaction that a provider has with a health plan, because this is a significantly costly transaction. So what we have done, and as we've continued to do, is to be engaged with the industry. Even going back to when we developed the Phase 4 operating rules and with the guidance from NCVHS, that we need to do more work on this particular function within and interaction within the healthcare system. We've taken that to heart. We've launched the Phase 5 operating rule endeavor, along with a number of other entities that have worked through and highlighting some of these particular issues, all the way from the HELP Committee to the CAQH Core Board to ONC's work with reducing clinician burden through CMS's efforts, as well as the AMA, the WEDPA Council, HL7, HADA, and the Da Vinci Project. So lots of effort in this particular component of the transaction and the revenue cycle. And we want to make sure that we're working consistently with every organization that's engaged. what we see as a significant part of our vision for prior authorization is to move it from this manual, heavily focused on manual process, both at the provider site as well as the health plan site, into a more optimized solution, right? How can we get the industry to migrate from something that is very manual, very heavily touched by hand, literally, usually a fax machine is involved, or a telephone, to getting to a place where the industry can develop and use specific standards to conduct a transaction between a provider and a plan as we move even to real time. We start with our foundation of phase 4, which really lays the really basic requirements for trading partners. It has connectivity, it has security, it has response times. It has specific things that providers and health plans and those entities that support them, clearinghouses and vendors, can do to start setting up systems and applications to conduct a transaction or an interaction between the provider and the plan. The draft phase 5 rules take the next step that's required to ensure systems can be built, automation can be added to these systems and applications. That includes necessary data content within the transaction, both from the inquiry to the response. What data does the provider need to submit? What kind of data does the health plan need to have in the inquiry? And how do they then process and adjudicate that in a way that an automated response can come out and be sent back to the provider? So that greater consistency across the entire process can help, again, those applications be built, those systems be remediated, and things can go from a manual process to more optimized, automated process. Ongoing for 2019, as we continue to move forward and think about PA, we're going to continue to work with potential pilot requirements. These could continue to test our phase 4 and phase 5 requirements, as well as other additional requirements that have come up through discussion with our subgroups and work groups of determining whether an authorization is even required for a particular service or pharmaceutical product, and also to see if there is a need for the industry to come up with a specific time frame for a final determination. We do have some basic requirements in phase 4 around that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And phase 5 may be able to extend that, as well as our additional work with pilots going through 2019. We also do want to thank the industry and all of the participants that have worked with us over the course of the last 18 months in developing the rule set. This does include 2 different main groups, our advisory group members, as well as our group co-chairs. As you can see, we try to ensure that we have some of the leaders within the industry be part of this and be engaged with CAQH Core. They're all participating organizations with us. They're all part of the larger conversation within the industry. So a big thank you to everyone who has worked with us to date. And just as I do want to just highlight quickly our process and how we get to where we are today. Again, our advisory group did meet. They identified a number of opportunity areas. Those opportunity areas are all places where potential rules and rule requirements could be fielded from. We then move those particular opportunity areas into our rules work group and our technical work group. And those work groups help develop, with this input from the subgroup, very particular requirements, right? Every little particular requirement comes up from the subgroup, is reviewed and analyzed by the rules work group, and then are passed on to the next phase in the process, pun intended. So each of those groups have their specific roles and functions. They do their thing, and then we pass it off to the all-core vote, which is where we are at actually today. So the core voting participating organization ballot is out, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a moment. But that doesn't end the process. Once the core participants complete their review, the core board also does review the entire rule package and has recommendations for the industry, and also what we need to do next as a particular industry advocate for certification, for use of the transactions, for advocacy, and for education. That all is part of the process as well. Just to give you a little insight, I know this is a lot of detail. We won't go over it in a lot of detail, but we do want to let you know that the advisory group did work from our environmental scan findings with a lot of potential areas for work and opportunity. And they worked through their subgroups and the work groups to kind of drill down to those specific requirements. And so we take the 80-20 approach, right? So we may not have included everything that originally came out of our environmental scan, but that also allows us to do work in the future, right? Part of the work for 2019 is to look at a couple of the things that may have fallen off from the advisory group and from the subgroup, but now we can go back and work on those too as the next step in our process. So we understand that we don't cover everything. It's not a panacea for all of the problems that face PA today, but taking this stepped, phased approach with an 80-20 eye on what we need to work on now and then what we can work on in the future is really helpful for us to plan a multi-year goal and multi-year projects. So again, thanks for all your work. As our participants were part of our advisory group, our subgroups, and our work groups, you're helping us define what our next project's going to be this year as well as in the years in the future. We do want to highlight some of the specific challenges that were identified by our environmental scan and then subsequently by our advisory group and our subgroups and work groups, because the rules specifically key into these challenges. Again, this is not a complete list of everything that is a particular challenge, but it is a list of some of the key findings from the industry that we want to make sure that we can try to address. And some of this is right off the bat with providers determining if a PA is actually required, what kind of information they need to submit in a PA inquiry. Providers spend a lot of time, energy, and effort in doing this first step. And I know this is anecdotal, but in our site visits with one particular healthcare system, over 40 full-time staff sit around all day long, 8 hours a day, and all they do is validate for PA, request PAs, and follow up with PA inquiries. So it's a very time-consuming component of what providers do in the PA process. A couple other examples, I won't go through everything, is that health plans often have to pend or deny a PA request because of incorrect, incomplete, or inconsistent patient identification within the transaction, within the web portal, within the phone call, within the fax, and it is burdensome for the providers. They then have to go back and track the correct demographic information. It is all the while the PA is actually pended on the health plan site. And we all know that that pend, the clock starts ticking. And once that expires, that PA is going to be denied. So how do we resolve that issue between identifying the specific information that should be submitted on the inquiry that the health plan can match, identify the member, identify the benefits, and identify the PA requirements? We need to smooth that process around that data identification and make sure that it is submitted, it can be validated, and we can put in places and ways and applications and means to do this in an automated way, not all manual. We'll go into the next slide so you can see where part of the rules that we've developed, both in phase 4 and in phase 5, help address many of these issues. And we do star these between the different phases, but you can see that as a combined rule set, it really addresses many of the substantive issues that have been identified through the industry review on how we can address some of these larger challenges. I mentioned patient identification issues. In phase 5, we do have requirements around consistent patient identification and how a health plan can help identify specific needs for that data and respond with specific errors and specific error codes. Right? Those codes can really help providers identify this particular data element is missing or it's incorrect or invalid. I can go back to my EHR, validate the information on this particular member and resubmit and help smooth that process along. Again, for phase 4, it did identify and has specific requirements for the infrastructure, as I mentioned, connectivity, security, companion guides, initial response times. Phase 5 layers on, again, the specific data requirements for the transaction. And again, another good example would be the consistent use of codes. I mentioned AAA just a moment ago, but there are other code values within the transaction that are also going to be very important for the provider to understand and identify when they are making corrections to append, what kind of data needs to be submitted on the follow-up inquiry or on the initial inquiry so that they don't get append. And what's really key here for the phase 5 rules, as we saw with phase 3 and phase 2 in the past, it's going to be consistent for all health plans. All health plans that you're interacting with as a provider will use the code values in a consistent way. So it's not a different business process for the providers by every time that they submit a different transaction to a different health plan. That consistency goes a long way in reducing provider burden. And with that, I'll hand the call over to Noam, who will walk us through the actual rules package.
Thank you, Bob, and hello, everyone. I'm Noam Nahari from Montefiore Medical Center, and I was co-chair of the Prior Authorization Rules Workgroup. I'm now going to give an overview of the Phase 5 CAQH Core Operating Rules Package. Let's move on to the next screen, please. There we go. The draft Phase 5 CAQH Core Operating Rules Package consists of two main components. The draft Phase 5 CAQH Core Operating Rule Set, which contains two draft rules, and the draft Phase 5 CAQH Core Certification Test Suite. This is the package the core voting participating organizations will vote on if they haven't already done so. The draft Phase 5 prior authorization rules focus on standardizing key components of the prior authorization process and closing gaps in electronic data exchange to move the industry towards a more automated adjudication of a request. These efficiencies enable shorter time to final adjudication and more timely delivery of patient care. The draft Phase 5 Certification Test Suite contains the requirements that must be met by an entity seeking core certification on the Phase 5 operating rules to show conformance with the rules and be awarded a core certification seal. A bit later on, we will go through both rule requirements and the certification test suite in detail, but first I'll start with a quick overview of the Phase 5 operating rules package voting and timeline, and when the rules and test suite will be available for the industry. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Okay. Voting representatives at core voting participating organizations received the final core vote ballot package email last week on Tuesday, March 12th. Core voting participating organizations are entities that create, use, or transmit healthcare administrative data in daily business. The vote on the operating rules package will remain open until Wednesday, April 3rd. More details on who received the final core vote ballot email, what was included in the email, and how to submit a ballot for your organization will be provided towards the end of this webinar. For the Phase 5 operating rules package to pass and be forwarded to the CAQH core board vote, a quorum of at least 60% must be met for the final core vote, with at least 66.67% approval. The CAQH core board vote is expected to launch next month, April 2019, following the final CAQH core vote, and will wrap up by the beginning of May 2019. The published Phase 5 rule set will be available in May along with FAQs posted on our website. CAQH Core will complete the Phase 5 Core Certification Testing site by the end of 2019. Following the test site launch, entities will be able to certify and show conformance with the new rules. Throughout the rest of the year, Core will continue to make additional implementation tools available and conduct industry education via webinars and conferences. Now we'll start a deep dive into each rule, beginning with the data content rule, and I'll hand it over to Rhonda to begin.
Thank you, Noam. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rhonda Starkey from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. I was a co-chair of the Prior Authorization Subgroup and the Rules Workgroup. So on the next slide, what we see is summary of the draft Phase 5 CAQH Core Prior Authorization 278 Request Response Data Content Rule. And that rule targets one of the most significant problem areas in the prior authorization process, which is requests for medical services that are pended due to missing or incomplete information, primarily medical necessity information. These rule requirements reduce the unnecessary back and forth between providers and health plans and seek to enable a shorter adjudication timeframes and fewer staff resources spent on manual follow-up. Specific rule requirements include, first, a consistent patient identification and verification to reduce common errors and denials. Next, the return of specific AAA error codes and action codes when certain errors are detected on the request. Also, the return of a healthcare service decision reason code to provide the clearest explanation to the submitter of the errors. Fourth, the use of the PWK01 attachment type code or logical identifiers names, LOINC codes, and the PWK01 code to again provide clearer direction on status and what is needed for adjudication. And then lastly, to detect and display all of the 278 response data code descriptions to reduce the burden of interpretation. And we can move to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we can stay here. So if we step back and then talk a little bit about what's in scope, the prior authorization 278 data content rule applies to the 5010X217 278 request response transactions for prior authorizations for procedures, laboratory testing, medical services, devices, supplies, or medications within the medical benefit. The rule applies when any HIPAA-covered entity and its agents use, conduct, or process the 278 transaction. As many of you know, there are many business events that this transaction supports, but we want to highlight the business events supported by the transaction that the rule requirements do not apply to, so are out of scope. The first is referrals are not included in the scope because the focus of our data content rule is really to mitigate the pain points for prior authorization requests for medical services. And many surveys revealed that the use case of referrals was one of the most, many surveys revealed that the use case of the medical necessity and prior authorization piece was one of the most common reasons for pens and denials, while our environment scan and subsequent subgroup and workgroup polling consistently did not find referral requests to be routinely delayed. Emergency and urgent requests are also out of scope, as the ACA, Affordable Care Act, prohibits requirements for prior authorization to access emergency services. And finally, the rule does not apply to prior authorizations for retail pharmacy services and medications. The National Council for Prescription Drug Programs covers these programs and operating rules, and they are therefore not addressed in the CAQH core operating rules. And now we can move to the next slide. This slide shows a zoomed out view of the deeper dives we're going to be getting into on the subsequent slides. What you see is each data content rule requirement bucket is listed on the left-hand side. And then you will see the color-coded dots to indicate which requirement that applies to. And then each requirement traces back to those challenges and high-level solutions that we highlighted earlier. And on the next slide, we begin to go back and look at what we learned in the extensive environmental scan, where health plans most often pend or deny a prior auth request due to missing, incomplete, or inaccurate information submitted on the request, which includes patient ID. To encourage more consistent and accurate submission of patient information, this requirement specifies the data field, which includes the loop and segment, in which a provider must submit identifying information if the patient is a subscriber. And it also requires the data field, again, the loop and segment, in which a provider must submit identifying information if the patient is a dependent. The rule requires that when a health plan and its agent receive the request, they should normalize the patient last name. And normalization applies to specific characters in a patient's last name, which include punctuation values, special characters, uppercase letters, name suffixes, and prefixes. And by requiring the character strings to be removed during name normalization and recommending a set of punctuation values to be used to delimit last name from suffix or prefix, normalization promotes successful adjudication of information that was included on the request and is being reviewed by the health plans. On the bottom of this slide, you will see what is out of scope for this rule requirement. And the rule requirement does not require a core certified entity to internally store data elements. It doesn't require conversion of letter case and or special characters by any party for subsequent processing of the data through external systems. It does not require that we specify whether the full last name or only a portion of the last name must be validated, and does not specify the search criteria. So I think we'll move to the next slide, please. The data content rule requirements also address scenarios where the information included on a response does not provide sufficient detail to know why a request was pended and what information a health plan needs to resolve the pend. The rule requires that the health plan and its agents must return the appropriate healthcare services review element HCR 01 action code of A4 pended, as well as the appropriate HCR 03, which is the review decision reason industry code, and either the appropriate PWK 01 attachment report type code, or a combination of a logical observation identifier's name and codes, or LOINC, and the appropriate PW10K attachment report type code. This will enable providers to know what types of additional documentation are required by the health plan in order for their prior authorization request to be fully adjudicated. To encourage movement toward a more automated and streamlined processing of the request and flagging the need for additional documentation, the rule also requires that the health plan process submitted diagnosis, procedure, and revenue codes that fall into types of services that are often pended for medical necessity. This will allow the industry to make progress in building logic into adjudication systems for prior authorization. Categories of services included in the rule are included at the bottom of the slide. It should be noted that this requirement uses the standard terms as used in the 278 Technical Report Type 3. The rule does not require providers to submit diagnosis or procedure codes. On the next slide, the next bucket of requirements fall under the umbrella of consistent use of codes to indicate errors, decisions, and next steps. Consistent and uniform use of the AAA error codes and action codes requires the return of the most specific AAA error code and the most specific action code in the response when certain errors are detected in the request. Additionally, requiring the return of a healthcare service decision reason code in the HCR segment sends the most comprehensive information back to the provider. On the next slide, we look at the final area of rule, which is the detection and display of the 278 response data element which requires the receiver of the 278 response to detect and extract all data elements, the data element codes, and the corresponding code definitions to which the rule applies in the 278 response. The rule also requires the receiver to display or otherwise make the data appropriately available to the end user without altering the semantic meaning of the 278 response data content. This will assist with easing the burden of interpretation of codes on provider staff so that they can understand the next steps. At this point now, I'll hand the call back to Noam, who will walk us through the requirements of the draft Phase 5 Prior Authorization Web Portal Rule.
Thanks, Rhonda. Let's get started by reviewing what's in and out of scope for the Web Portal Rule. So moving on to the next slide. There we go. The draft Phase 5 CAQH Core Prior Authorization Web Portal Rule builds a bridge towards overall consistency for referral and prior authorization requests and responses by addressing fundamental uniformity for data fields, ensuring confirmation of the receipt of a request, and providing for system availability. Specific rule requirements include the use of 5010-278 request response TR3 implementation names or alias names for the web portal data field labels to reduce variation, system availability requirements for a health plan to receive requests to enable predictability for providers, confirmation of receipt of requests to reduce manual follow-up for providers, adherence to the requirements outlined in the 278 request response data content rule when the portal operator maps the collected data from the web portal to the 5010-278 transaction. In terms of scope of this rule, the prior authorization web portal rule applies to any web portal used to submit a referral, as well as prior authorization for procedures, laboratory testing, medical services, devices, supplies, or medications within the medical benefit. The rule applies when any entity and its agent makes available a web portal to a provider to submit a prior authorization request or referral. I will now highlight what is out of scope for the web portal rule. As with the data content rule, this rule does not apply to prior authorizations for retail pharmacy services and medications, given that the NCPDP covers these standards and operating rules. Additionally, the rule does not require any entity to conduct, use, or process a prior authorization or referral via a web portal if it does not currently do so. Moving on to the next slide. This slide shows a zoomed out view of the deeper dives of the web portal rule we'll be getting into in the subsequent slides. Each major web portal rule requirement bucket is listed on the left, and you'll see corresponding color-coded dots to indicate who the requirement applies to. On slide 27, yes. Let's start off with system availability and reporting requirements. The system availability requirement in the prior authorization web portal rule requires that the web portal be available no less than 86% per calendar week, consistent with the availability requirements in the prior phases for the standard transactions, including the 278. This allows for 24 hours per calendar week for regularly scheduled web portal downtime. In addition to system availability in general, health plans and their agents must make available their notices of scheduled downtime, holidays, and any non-routine downtime. In addition, they must provide information within 1 hour of emergency downtime and publish non-routine downtime at least 1 week in advance. During downtime, web portals are not required to send a response to notify the provider the web portal is down and where to submit a prior authorization request. However, the web portal operator should provide an alternate method of submission during downtime if applicable. Moving on to the next slide. Okay. The prior authorization web portal rule also requires that health plans and vendors return a submission receipt to the provider indicating that the prior authorization form was successfully received and notifying the web portal operator of any next steps unless the system is down and therefore unable to process requests. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see examples of this receipt and the next steps that could be returned to the web portal operator. These include notification that the web portal operator requires additional documentation to process the request, option to print and save a PDF, view the prior authorization status, the status or an update of a previously submitted request, assignment of a transaction or reference control number, a detailed time step, potentially including date, time, and time zone of the submission. I would like to note that the examples listed on this slide do not represent an exhaustive list of what information could be returned to the web portal operator, but only a few examples. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. In an effort to bring consistency and standardization to web forms, the web portal rule requires the use of the 5010-278 request and response TR3 implementation names for the web portal data field labels on both the request form and the response. Another option is for entities to use the TR3 alias field name, which at times may be more recognizable to those operating the portal and submitting the form, while still within the standard TR3. In addition, to ease understanding, the requirement notes that web portal operators may present supplemental information regarding the data fields via a mouse hover function or some similar functionality. Finally, the web portal rule requires that if a web portal operator maps the data collected from the web form to the X12-278 request for review and response transaction, it must then conform with the Phase 5 CAQH Core Prior Authorization 278 Request Response Data Content Rule. I will now turn the call over to Bob to discuss the Phase 5 Certification Test Suite.
Great, thank you, Noam. And half the work that we do is not only related to the development of the rule set, but we also develop a certification test program for every phase to ensure that the industry moves through and forward with adoption of the rules. So part of the work that we did for Phase 5 is to complete that certification test suite as well. Now, the test suite and the certification program are very much a part of who we are. Many of you may have seen the announcement earlier this week. We have reached over 350 certification seals that we've published and issued. Again, this is a way for us to build a program that not only ensures conformance and compliance, usually hear that with phases 1 through 3, but for phases 4 and 5, really to make sure that the industry moves towards adoption of the requirements. It does provide assurance that your systems can do the requirements, so it builds confidence within the industry. Also with your trading partners, your clearinghouses and vendors, this is also very important for them, so there's some consistency as they build systems and applications to support the transactions. It is a program that is developed by the industry for the industry. Again, the core participants come together, identify the specific requirements that should be tested through certification, and then the particular test scripts are then drafted for those requirements. It's not complete, doesn't test every little requirement, but it tests the ones that the industry thinks are the most important to be tested. Again, it is a phased approach. We do have a phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and now a phase 5 certification testing program soon for phase 5, right? Will be launched later this year. It's really important too for us that the test suite defines that particular criteria. Again, the goal is to ensure that it does meet industry need, that industry can conduct the 278 transaction with the specific data content requirements that were specified through the discussion today and that are specified in the rule requirements as well. Again, we have developed this for every previous phase. We're continuing to do that here in phase 5 as well. It does also retain the same organization sections within the program. So if you are an entity that's gone through previous phases of certification, it will look very, very much the same. We kept it very consistent with introduction sections, with guidance sections on how to complete a gap analysis and a mitigation plan, and what you actually have to do for those specific test scenarios. Again, there will be 2 for this particular rule set, 1 for data content for the 278. As Rhonda went through those requirements, and as Noam went through the requirements for the web portal, we also have those key rule requirements identified, the conformance test requirements, the test scripts, assumptions by the rule, as well as detailed step-by-step test scripts. So everything will be spelled out and specified, each particular requirement that you'll have to go through as you complete voluntary certification testing. And with that, I'll hand the call over to Rhonda Starkey to walk through the next steps.
Thank you, Bob. As Bob said, I'll now go over the next steps, including details on how to submit the official final core vote, which is currently out for ballot. On the next slide, primary representatives and contacts who were engaged in the Phase 5 rule development from full CAQH core voting participating organizations received the official final core vote ballot via email last Tuesday, March the 12th. If you did not receive it, please contact core@caqh.org if you have any questions about who received the official ballot for your ballot email for your organization. We understand that many people participate within the same organization and that sometimes it's helpful to see the names of your colleagues that are involved. Please note that we've listed the participating organizations with full voting rights at this level in the appendix of this deck. Only participating organizations that create, use, or transmit healthcare electronic data have full voting rights at this level. The official final core vote ballot email contained the draft Phase 5 CAQH core operating rule package being balloted. Voting organizations are asked to select yes, no, or abstain to indicate whether your organization supports the entire rule package, which contains the draft Phase 5 CAQH core operating rule set, comprised of the draft Phase 5 CAQH core prior authorization 278 request response data content rule, and the draft Phase 5 CAQH core prior authorization web portal rule. Also included is the draft Phase 5 CAQH core certification test suite. It should be noted that sections 1, 2, and 5 are identical in both rules. For your organization's vote to be included in the official ballot results, organizations must submit their response via the online submission link by close of business Wednesday, April the 3rd, 2019. While organizations may have more than one representative who was sent the official final core vote ballot email, each organization may only submit one response. This means that you should work together with your colleagues to develop and submit your organization's response. To help facilitate this coordination, a fillable PDF version of the ballot was attached to the email, in addition to PDFs of the draft rules and certification test suite. Results of the final CAQH core vote will be shared via email following the balloting period. And if we move to the next slide. In addition to PDFs of the draft rules and certification test suite included in the final ballot email, CAQH core developed additional resources for voting participant organizations to utilize during the voting period. These resources are contained in the Phase 5 website, where participants can find updates on the status of the Phase 5 operating rule package, including a one-page overview of the draft 5 rule package, and links to previous webinars that highlight CAQH core's work on prior authorization. Once the operating rule package is final, CAQH core will be developing new Phase 5 implementation tools and guidelines, which will also be available on the Phase 5 webpage. And I'd now like to turn it over to Jessica to facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. We do have some time for Q&A right now. If you have any questions, you can submit them on the questions panel on the dashboard. I recognize that we have just shared quite a bit of information with you, so it makes sense that right now we have a shy crowd with us. But you know that you can reach us via email if you do have any questions in the future. So given that, for some closing remarks, I'm going to send it back to Bob Bowman.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And I know we'll wait and hold on for just a couple more minutes as we see if any questions do come in. We hope that the presentation today does answer a majority of those questions, both with the level of detail that we reviewed the rule requirements with you for, as well as the kind of next steps in the process for the balloting. Again, I want to thank not only the CAQH core staff that really supported this project over the last 18 months or more, and all the effort that they have taken, but also the industry as well as the core participants that you represent in all the efforts that you have taken in supporting the project, as well as making sure that we have identified the right requirements. We've done the right job in working with the industry and all the different participants to make sure that everything is really copacetic, that the rules do really can achieve some of that optimization of automation, right?
So Bob, we did receive a question regarding which organizations can vote.
Yeah, we've included also in the slide deck, which you'll have access to later tomorrow, a complete listing of all of the core participants that are actually voting members that are in good standing. So this list does not list all core participants, because some participants actually do not get a vote on the ballot. And some of those are because they are SDO organizations that don't build or construct or conduct the transaction from trading partner to trading partner. And again, this is part of our procedures in the voting process. Every organization helps draft the requirements of the subgroup and the work group levels. They vote and ballot and are part of the straw polling process to develop the rule requirements. But really only those entities that do create, transmit, or use administrative data get the actual vote on the ballot. So here's a complete list. We do have this for you. So if you have any friends that you know that may or may not be engaged as they should be, reach out to them. We do want to have, again, we do have very specific quorum requirements, both for the number that vote as well as % of approval. So we will be reaching out. All of you should have received your ballot. You may not be this particular representative, as was mentioned, so you on the call may not have received the ballot, but someone in your organization, if you see your name listed here, did receive that. So we do have, as was mentioned, a PDF. We have tools to help facilitate the intercommunication within the organization to facilitate that gathering of the information to vote. We also have another question that just came in. Hopefully that addressed the question. With the 70-30 reviews now out, expectation of 70-30 will be mandated soon. The implementation of the phase 5, that's a great question, and one that we do have a process for. So I do have an answer for you. Anytime that we move from one version of the standard to another, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an X12 standard, it could be any standard that we have operating rules for. Anytime that the federal regulations move from one standard to the next, we do have a process that we kick off that is kind of an automated process. We review all of the particular rule requirements. We'll make edits and updates to those rules. We will look to our rules work group co-chairs and the members of the rules work groups to do a review of those documents, of the revised rules, and go through that process. So we do have a process in place. We do understand that 70-30 is currently going through a review, an industry review. We can't really project when that will be complete, potentially sometime in 2019 or 2020. And then we'll go through the typical review process at NCHS and HHS. So a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year time frame is probably can be expected. I know there's a pretty wide spread there, but it's also really important. So again, it's we do have a process for, as we migrate from one standard to the next. We'll implement that process when that does take place. We have another question here as well. And the question is the value of the vote between a yes, a yay, or a nay. There's also the option to abstain. We do understand, as you can see, there's a lot of entities that are on this list in front of you right now. Some of them may not have a tool or application or a widget or a kind of any skin in the game when it comes to PA, and they were not part of the process along the way. So we totally understand, and why we also provide for the ability for those organizations to abstain if they don't feel like they can vote a yes or they can vote a no. So the abstention is also a very important element in the process. We understand that some of the perhaps financial organizations or maybe banks that are not involved in PA in that part of the revenue cycle, for example, they would have the option to abstain from the vote. So another important question as well.
We don't have any other questions. So I think I want to thank our speakers and our audience for joining us today. And just a reminder that tomorrow you'll receive the slide deck and the recording that you can use for your reference. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.